Hey there, I'm Jessica Lauren Walton, and this is the Insecurity Podcast. If there's a cool story in the security field or just something that I think is going to be valuable for my fellow professionals, then I want to talk about it. To learn more about the work I do as a writer, you can go ahead and visit my blog at jessicawaltonwriter.com. Today's guest is Marine veteran Gary Hess. He is the founder and executive director of the Veterans Alliance for Holistic Alternatives. After serving in the U.S. military for over a decade, including to various combat zones across the Middle East, Gary struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and chronic pain. So part of his journey in looking for effective treatments led him to the work he does today in psychedelic assisted therapy and advocacy in the mental health space for veterans. So Gary and I met just last month at a mental health symposium in Washington, D.C. He was on a panel where he spoke about his personal experience, a general overview of the psychedelic treatments that are considered effective today and what's going on Capitol Hill regarding legislation. So he's going to give us a comprehensive look today. I'm really excited to get educated in this space. And that's it. I've said enough. Let's go in there and start talking to Gary. Hey, Gary, nice to see you today.
And you as well. Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, so for context, we just met last month at the John P. Mayhugh Hero's Journey Symposium in Washington, D.C. You spoke a little bit about your organization and your experience in the psychedelic treatment space, in particular for veterans and other survivors of trauma. And this is a topic that I've been looking for somebody to talk to about this topic actually for several months now. Partly because last year I participated in the Hero's Journey Symposium. I wound up presenting part of a white paper on moral injury on Capitol Hill afterwards, and the topic of psychedelic treatments kept coming up on the Hill. People who were interested in veteran mental health issues kept asking me about it, and I had to admit I don't know anything. In the past year, I've spoken to a lot of veterans, police officers who've had post-traumatic stress disorder, or they've had a traumatic brain injury, and they tried so many treatments, which was very frustrating. And they wound up trying psychedelic treatments that were really powerful, really, helped them change their lives. And I know that there's a lot of stuff going on with the regulation, with legislation. And you spoke so well at the symposium in this comprehensive way that I was really excited to follow up with you and gain some of that knowledge.
Yeah, thank you so much. The perspective comes from the gift of struggle, and so I'm able to share it in the way that I do because I came home and looked for answers that were not easily found, and so struggle of finding those answers that have led me to a place that I never thought I would be right here talking about this conversation, right, and exploring these different modalities to healing. So thank you for having me, and yeah, it was great meeting you, and I'm very excited to have this conversation unfold.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a real blessing when you can take painful experiences and turn them into something meaningful and beneficial for others, which you've clearly done. So, just jumping in, tell me a bit about your background, including, what led you to the work you do today with the Veterans Alliance for Holistic Alternatives.
Yeah, so I mentioned the gift of struggling. I came from my military experience as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps, but in order to really understand the full scope of the perspective and the perspective that I speak from, I think it's important to share my upbringing, being raised in the very deep South of Louisiana. in a very conservative community, these cannabis psychedelics, they were absolutely demonized. If I spoke of these things, if I was, God help me, if I was caught doing any of these things, my grandfather, my father would literally, they would beat my ass. Excuse my language, but this is just something, the stigmas that surrounded it. There was no medical value. It led to failure. It was addictive. It was a gateway drug, right? These were the
Right.
conversations that were deeply embedded in me from a very young age, and most of us that are in my age range, growing up in a just say no era. And and uh, and so it got to the point where, I played athletics throughout my childhood, throughout high school. I played college baseball, and then I joined the military. I both enlisted and as an officer, and I think that was at the peak of my struggle was because of that experience. And in short, um, as an infantry officer, I was deployed in multiple deployments. They were very kinetic, highly kinetic experiences, a lot of loss of life. Um,
This was mainly in the Middle East, right?
yes, this was
Mm.
in Iraq, and a lot of loss of life, a lot of exposure to it. Um, and I think we can get deeper into that as we go on. But the one that really shifted it for me was the day after Christmas in 2006. They had a full-size Traxel dump truck loaded with C4 that ran into the house we were occupying and detonated. And the things that unfolded that day, my body did not have a file folder for it, and that was the beginning of the end of my military service. And so, as I transitioned out, I came home and I turned my hands over to the Western model of medicine through the VA and highly preferred private practices. And the answers and options I was given to heal were ineffective, to say the least. And
Yeah.
at the end of the decade, the best answer was literally taking my own life, not because it was impulsive, is because I had tried everything and I was completely mentally and physically exhausted. And I felt that I was out of options. And logically, that felt like the best answer. My existence was causing struggle and pain for those around me. I was incredibly disconnected from everyone that I held close. I was disconnected from myself, and I had no answers. I had no way forward. Um, and then I crossed the lines of legality, and I tried a medicine that at the time was illegal in my own state. And the truth is that it did everything that the medicines were supposed to do. And it gave me an option. It gave me hope. It gave me a tool to use in my healing path that was safe, it was efficient, and it was very effective for me. And it allowed me to start doing some very intentional work, and digging deep into that trauma and understanding how it affected me. And from there, from cannabis, I realized I could only go so far. I was starting to rely on cannabis too much. And that's when I found psychedelic assisted therapies and plant medicines
Mm.
and entheogens. And they gave me the answers that I was looking for. And so through my struggle, I have a very intimate understanding of trauma from the inside out, suicidal ideation, and the thoughts behind those who are choosing to take their own life. And I have found tools to effectively get from not the bottom of the barrel, but it's when the bottom of the barrel falls out and there's nothing to grab onto.
Mm.
It's those and those who are in that position that I can sit here and say that, brother, sister, I was there, and there is a way out, and there is an incredible life on the other side, and it takes work to get there, but there are some effective tools and some emerging therapies that we are starting to gain access to that can help us get out of this hole. And so this is the perspective that I speak from, and these things have helped me in ways that it's hard for me to comprehend sometimes, but my life has been devoted to it. My life has been devoted to understanding it, understanding the wounds that are very deep within our soul, not just our psyche, and on understanding the process and the tools and techniques we have to become whole again. And it's through that reconnection of self and through that reconnection of community, and we create that wholeness where we can actually reintegrate back into a functional society. And that's the message here, and that's what we are
Yeah.
trying.
Yeah. Look, I think self-awareness, understanding the trauma you went through and having the breathing space to actually be able to analyze it is really powerful. I don't speak from personal experience. I'm just speaking, you know, as a reflection from a lot of other people I've spoken to with trauma. You first need that breathing space in order to not be overwhelmed, to take a step back, to like look at it a little more objectively and to start unpacking it. Right. So it sounds like, the treatment that you found to be effective gave you that breathing space, gave you, that first step towards unpacking the trauma. So, yeah, so tell me a little bit about the therapies that you've tried over the years. What worked, what didn't work, and what are the insights that you gained?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
what I learned in regards to therapies are you talking about traditional therapies or non-traditional therapies or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the traditional therapies, and I think I'm probably telling a story that a lot of people within the veteran community will tell. When you go through the Western model, it's very much like an assembly line. It's insurance liability waivers, blood work, imaging, and you have two options: pharmaceuticals or surgeries.
Jeez.
And in the traditional therapeutic models, I went through the cognitive behavioral therapy, the prolonged exposure, EMDR. There were things that were so deeply embedded that my body would not give me access to. And so at best, these programs were ineffective, had high relapse rates, and it did not have the efficacy or the healing potential that I was looking for. And so it was in 2016, and cannabis was still illegal here in Louisiana. I call it medical cannabis. That was I wouldn't say the first therapy. I turned it into a therapy. That was the first tool that I found that was incredibly effective. Where you talked about having relief and finding space, just in breathing room, from the overwhelming weight that your carrier don't even realize that you're carrying it. And when you do gain that breathing room, it's just like, holy cow, what is this? But it
Yeah.
was cannabis that allowed me to do that, and what it allowed me to do was be into the present. And the way that it allowed that, if you look at PTSD in general, which is fear-based, it's driven by the animal brain. So it's hyperarousal in the amygdala, hypoarousal in the prefrontal cortex, and those two brains are not talking. When you are triggered, you are hijacked by the animal brain, and you are thrust into a survival response. That is the hyperaroused state that they're speaking of. It leads to alterations in cognitive behavior and mood, hyper intrusive thoughts, avoidance, the four pillars of PTSD. Where were we? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, we were talking about the different therapies you took. No, I'm glad that you actually talked about that and broke that down, like the components of PTSD. I think that's important to know as well. But yeah, we were talking about the different therapies, whether that's traditional or non-traditional that you've tried, and what worked and what didn't work.
So it was
Yeah,
cannabis in a breathing space, and that's what it did.
right.
Is
The
is it
breathing
literally
space. Yeah,
it reversed the stress response. I didn't understand that it was doing this at the time, but what it gave me breathing space where I found myself for the first time in a decade fully in the present, where I could analyze the thoughts that were going through my head or just observe the thoughts that were going through my head. I could observe the
yeah,
sensations in my body without being mobilized into a stress response. I was able to see all parts of the picture and just observe and start putting some of these puzzle pieces together. And so what I started doing with cannabis is first of all finding a strain that worked for me that allowed me to get into the present. My first time trying cannabis, it just drove me into a very paranoid state, and I didn't touch it again for 2 years. And so at the recommendation of one of the Marines that served underneath me, I tried cannabis, and it brought me fully into the present. And this was a tool that could reverse the stress response. And so I started using it with intention. What I mean by that is, for example, I would go into a sushi restaurant that was non-threatening. It was in a community that I grew up in. But as I sat there with a friend of mine, my body becomes very hyper aroused. I'm getting anxious.
Mhm.
My blood pressure is going through the roof. I can feel my face getting
You
hot.
probably feel exposed. You feel exposed in the restaurant.
My
Yeah.
body know what I was feeling. I just knew I was not comfortable there and I needed
Yeah.
to get out. And that's what happens. It is so, and that's how the avoidance and the isolation starts. But now I can go into this sushi restaurant. I knew this was a trigger for me. I didn't know why it was a trigger. Obviously there was a lot going on for my mind, and as my mind was detecting everything as a threat, it became very exhausting and my body did not want to be in that environment. And so I knew this was a triggering situation. So I can consume the right strain of cannabis. I can bring myself into the present. I can put myself back into that situation within that sushi restaurant. I can produce a good outcome. And what I'm doing is teaching my body that this situation is safe again. So I'm facilitating the learning process with cannabis. Learning that something is safe again is part of that learning process. And that's something that you don't even realize when you come home, that you start learning that these situations are safe again. And so through the intentional use of cannabis, I started doing these things. And by reducing the hyperarousal, by reducing the hot coals, it allowed stability and consistency in those areas of life that were breaking down because of the lack of it. And so cannabis became an incredible tool, and it became an avenue for discovery. On one hand, it was absolute joy, bliss, and excitement because I had a tool that I can now help control the behavior that was out of my conscious control. And at the same time, I was incredibly angry because they had been lying to me for so long. And now that I'm involved in the advocacy and see the way that the money flows and the money works and how lobbying influences the decision of the policymakers,
Yeah.
uh, it makes me incredibly angry that here is an incredibly effective natural tool, a natural plant that can be used as a tool to help relieve some of the pressure and load that we are carrying because of the service that we offer to this country, right? Help me gain access to that. So there was an incredible amount of anger that they were lying to me about these things. This is a plant that was illegal. It did everything that the medicines were supposed to do. It was incredibly helpful for me in my healing journey. I now help others regain their lives through the intentional use of cannabis, through conscious cannabis ceremonies, through integrating cannabis and breath work to get to a deeply connected felt sense within our body and reframing the perspective that is driving our automatic thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors. So, with the intentional use of that, it is an incredible tool that can be used to address this crisis we have in our country right now.
Is this being
The right,
administered through like some kind of program, the cannabis as a treatment? So you also mentioned that you got psychedelic assisted therapy, right? PAT.
yeah,
So did
yeah.
you try, and I'm also curious, is cannabis the only thing that you've tried, or are there other psychedelics
No, so
that you wound up using?
cannabis was so out of my wheelhouse, right? I was an athlete. I graduated top of my class. They beat me if I was to use this. So just
Right, the
over
stigma around it. Sure, sure.
overcome the stigmas. This was a very long process for me, and for probably the first couple years of using it, I didn't share it with anyone, right? It was difficult for me to talk about it and share with those who were closest to me, my family, my siblings. And I did. It was probably 3 years of very intentional work with cannabis, and I realized that there were some things that were still there that I could not get to. And I did I've been doing my homework on the psychedelic assisted therapies and ayahuasca. They released a documentary in 2018, but the only way to access these medicines were to go out the country, and there was just an incredible
Hmm.
amount of fear. Um, Whether I admit it or not, to leave the country again. The last time I was out of the country, some not so good things happened, and so my body didn't like the way that felt. I did
But that's
not trust.
exhausting too, to have to, I mean, you're already struggling with so much. To
Yeah,
have to leave the country to get a treatment, it's just
yeah,
seems like, yeah, that's just
yeah,
stretching you thinner. Yeah,
yeah.
interesting.
And turn your hands over to someone that you don't know, you don't trust. It was just
Mm.
incredibly difficult. And so it wasn't until um 21 that I finally gave in and I went to psychedelic assisted therapy. It started
Mm.
with combo, which is it was the combination was combo, the venom from an Amazonian tree frog,
Mm.
and followed by psilocybin, which is a deep discovery
Yeah.
tool that really targets the inner child, and then VAHA various, which is the natural form of 5-MeO-DMT, and
So you end up trying all of these treatments inside or outside the US?
it was inside the U.S. within
Okay.
an theogenic church. Yes.
Oh,
Um, I,
interesting.
yeah, I was slated for Ibogaine and outside of the country, and then that fell through, and I was bringing my senior enlisted that I served with me to go through the treatment because he had been struggling as well, and so we weren't just going to back out and prolong the process. We were in dire need. And so we found a psilocybin assisted therapeutic platform. And the combination and sequence of those medicines were incredibly powerful. They opened emotional pathways that were that were non-existent to me. I did not even realize that my body was no longer feeling sensations until after this treatment. Like I felt happiness and I could feel sensations in my body. Like I felt warmth in my shins and my calves. I felt it in my forearms. I felt it in my chest. And it was so odd to me. I'm like, what is this? Like it almost put me into a panic attack because I'm like, this is different. This is new. This is unsafe. Right. And that's
Well, it sounds
everything.
like you kind of disconnected from your body, like stopped feeling certain things, and then being reconnected to that was probably a shock. And I mean, look, putting aside trauma when you're out, like, man, people I've spoken to served, in Afghanistan who were like out in the desert for a while. There's a lot of discomfort. Your body suffers a lot, so people don't just come back with mental health issues, they have physical health issues too. So I imagine that to get through that, like, constant discomfort you feel, you also just kind of have to disconnect your mind from your body. But then it's a problem if you can't reconnect it back in the civilian world.
Yeah. And then at the same time, you learn to love the suffering, right? That's the part of that. That's a part of that service.
The
So
discipline, it's discipline,
yeah, it's almost like, you don't disconnect to it. You just learn to embrace it, which is the opposite of when we come home. We learn to avoid it, right? And part of that training and that workup process within the military is to suppress those emotions. Any kindness is a weakness that's going to lead to your death, essentially. And that's it gets very deeply embedded within us. Um, but feeling those sensations in my body is I can sit here and have a conversation with you about the mind-body disconnection. And those conversations were brought to me, uh, through my struggle. But until you don't realize that your body is not feeling, right? You are consciously aware of your environment as you're going through it. And you feel like you're in control of it. When your mind and body is disconnected, you are not. And
Mm.
you are not even consciously aware that you are not in control of it. And when you see and you start to realize the effects of the mind body disconnection of how it leads to the hyperarousal, how it leads to the intrusive thoughts, how it leads to the imbalance of your primal functions of eating, sleeping, digestion, memory, emotional regulation, and
Hmm.
arousal. Being disconnected from your body leads to the imbalance of that autonomic nervous system, which is controls every involuntary response within your body. And that is what stays elevated. That is what's creating the allostatic load. And so when you reconnect that body, which is reconnecting with those parts of your soul that you have exiled because it's too painful to access, that's becoming whole again. And by becoming whole
Mm.
again, we're reconnecting the mind and the body. And that's what we do through these practices. So the first thing I had to do was to learn the medicine and to learn these tools, you have to be able to effectively use them yourself. And so I became the guinea pig. Anything that I was going to ask anyone else to do, I did it myself. And I understood it to its depths of any which way but loose. And then I started bringing that to others to to assist them in their own healing journeys. And this is in that process also started seeing some of the gaps um,
Mhm.
in our healing modalities. And one of the one of the one of the ways that the psychedelic assisted therapies or entheogenic therapies work the best is they are addressing the moral and the spiritual issues of our wounds and our trauma. And they do it through a non-directive approach, right? And when you go through a clinical model, it's a very directed approach by another person that is influenced by their perspective and what they think is best for you in that healing process, right? And these medicines take a non-directive approach and they go to where your body needs it at the time. And it helps with that unlayering process of
Mhm.
these injuries, especially these moral injuries over time. Um, it opens critical learning periods. It takes our default mode network offline. It allows us to experience a non-dual state, which is one of the best healing properties of these medicines. And so as I go as I go through my life on a day-to-day basis, I experience the world based on my perspective. That is what's driving my behavior. My perspective is what is damaged and deeply guarded.
Yeah.
And so to be able to go in and take that completely offline so that you can see that traumatic experience in a way as it unfolded, not in a way that you perceived it. And it allows us to reconnect in ways and open emotional pathways that are not afforded through the clinical model. So
Right.
if we can take these tools and integrate them with the current clinical model that we have so that we can start providing access to it, there are clear answers to healing, not just suppressing the symptoms, healing, allowing us to heal. And there, I have my own opinions of why this is not being allowed to happen. But I can tell you right now, this is an incredibly effective tool.
Right.
And
Well, there's stigma. I mean, you mentioned the stigma of it, of using it recreationally, of people's lives being ruined from that, but you're obviously talking about a very different context and using these beneficially. Yeah, I wanted to say also something really interesting. Like, you're talking about, like, I'm trying to understand as somebody who's never tried any of these treatments, right? And I haven't had a need for it. It's just like I try to understand the internal experience. Yeah. So you're talking, I mean, we were talking before about needing that breathing space, right? Just to not be so overwhelmed by all the physical things going on in your body in response to the trauma. You talked about also that warmth, right? And that reconnecting to your body, something that I thought was so interesting. When I was speaking to a Marine veteran who had served in the Middle East, and he had been exposed to really ugly things that people tend to be exposed to, like allies, in Afghanistan that he had become close to, who were then you know, um, taken, tortured, executed, and he got a front row seat to that. And it was such extreme hatred that he was exposed to. And he said, I can't pronounce some of these drugs, but some of the treatments, the psychedelics that you mentioned, the cyclobin, some of the things that he tried because he was struggling for years with a lot of anger, even after he left the military. And he said what happened to him is he felt an overwhelming sense of love. It kind of pulled him in the other direction. Like he was exposed to all this hatred. And so you start to see the world that way. You start to see all this hatred around you. Um, but he got pulled in the other direction by taking this treatment, which there was like an overwhelming, in a good way, flood of love that he suddenly was able to access. And that kind of balanced him out. And he said that anger just like really melted away.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
That's interesting. That was interesting to me. Yeah.
it is incredibly interesting and it is incredibly consistent across most that go through it and
Mm,
experience. And this is where I really think we're missing the mark is with the PTSD treatments and the overlay and the overlap of moral injury,
hmm
we lose the ability for self-compassion and self-love, right? Even once we get beyond the fear-based of the PTSD treatments, right? Just fear-based and we reduce some of the hyperarousal and the fear, there's still shame and guilt
Hmm.
these deeply held moral beliefs just simply because of the things that we have experienced. And because our emotional center is damaged, I compare it to like a dog that had been hit in the street, but is still alive, right? Even though you're going to help the dog, it is injured and is going to bite you and because it does not want to be hurt anymore, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
But that's what our emotional system is like. And so, and this is what happens is and why it leads to isolation and avoidance because
Yeah.
emotion that you feel gets rerouted to those feelings of shame, guilt, betrayal, and our response is anger. It's a control mechanism. It is a natural
Mm.
human response to things that threaten us. So this is consistent throughout the entire community and throughout the trauma community in general is that our default mode becomes anger and we don't know why, right? So understanding that voice of anger and understand the physiological and the psychological reasons of why we're driven toward that anger. A big reason is we don't know how to love ourselves. We don't have self-compassion. We cannot hold space for ourselves. We are driven right into a stressed state, a very hyper-aroused state, and driven. Our bodies are driven to moments of control, and that's how the anger presents itself. And it plays out as an outburst, and then the day after, you're full of regret, and you're left picking up the pieces of your life again.
Mm.
And the cycle
Yeah.
can happen over and over and over.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad, we talked about some of those other emotions that are sometimes masking something else. I mean, anger, right, can also be masking grief, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, go on. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we jump into
That's
the next
something.
question? You good?
It, no, it's just it's something grief, right? It wasn't until probably my third journey.
Mm.
Um, the first one I felt took a big chunk of the iceberg, and then once you get past your combat trauma, you realize there's a whole lot of shit there in childhood that needs to be
Mm.
dealt with, right? And so it's a great tool to go deeper and deeper, but what you learn is what's beyond that anger and sadness and fear is just deep levels of grief. And when you said that, it just resonated with an ayahuasca experience that I had. It
Mm.
was just it took me 2 years into this work to finally sit with the grief that my body was holding, beyond the anger, beyond the fear, behind the cognitive reconciliation, that I was trying to make sense of myself. But the grief is huge. It's huge.
They say knowledge is power, but self-knowledge is also power.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, I
So
couldn't agree more.
yeah, no, I love that. No, thank you for sharing, both the internal experience and the external observations. So as of now, the use of psychedelic treatments for brain disorders, including post-traumatic stress, um, it's not approved by the U.S. military, right? For active service members. The Department of Defense has strict regulations regarding the use of controlled substances, and while research into psychedelics for therapeutic purposes is ongoing, they remain classified as illegal drugs under federal law. So some veterans and researchers are advocating for the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, but any treatment involving these substances would require significant clinical trials and regulatory changes before being accepted within military healthcare. So, from your perspective, what are the benefits versus the risks in allowing psychedelic treatments to be offered to active service members?
Clear benefits. Um, Deep emotional healing, reduce reliance on addictive medications, holistic healing through a biopsychosocial spiritual approach to heal in ways that um, are not effective or have not proven to be effective through the traditional models that we offered. And it can benefit them in the same ways that it is benefiting the veterans, that has been benefiting those outside of the veteran community. It can also benefit those on active duty. I would say the risks associated with it, just speaking from experience, they put a lot of money into fundamentally reorganizing your mind, habits, and instincts to do a job in service
Mm,
of this country, right? And a lot of that has to do with avoiding emotions or controlling emotions and tucking away and suppressing emotions in order to do the things that you were asked to do. And so, and this is not speaking from experience, but I would say one of the risks for the military uh, to provide access to those who are still currently on active duty is you might unwind the mindset that you have created. That
mm,
is a very
interesting.
it is an incredible tool, right? For those that are transitioning out that are still on active duty, 100%, absolutely. Even those that are still on active duty who have experienced an incredibly difficult experience, there are therapeutic modalities that can definitely assist them build resilience and maintain resilience and still keep them within the service that they are currently providing.
Mm,
MDMA is an incredible um, tool to use. It reduces the fear responses and allows you to do some deep emotional exploration in ways that are not done outside of that altered state of
mm.
consciousness. There are clear benefits and risks. Um, I think the biggest risk that you're seeing right now and the message that is being communicated from parents to children that is affecting the recruiting numbers and those that are going to choose to serve.
Mhm.
Son, I believe in your service, and I admire you for wanting to serve. But what happens when you come home and they abandon you and you're not taken care of and you're not giving all options that are needed to heal, right? Because that's what's happening now. And you have an overwhelming voice within the veteran community that's saying, hey, the treatments that you're providing, the legal options that you are providing and giving us as options to heal, not working. And for the last 2 decades, you're not listening to us, right?
Mm,
So what do you want me to communicate to my children? Why your numbers continue to suffer because you can't meet your recruiting quotas,
mm.
right? If you ask us to
Yeah.
go forward and do some of these unconscionable things, uh, give us the opportunity to heal in any way necessary. We'll be the guinea pigs for the clinical trials, for the research that is necessary, but give us the options we need to heal. So I think the biggest risk lies in inaction and not doing anything at this point.
There's something I have to ask because I'm very confused by a certain scenario, and I'm not looking to point fingers at any single organization, but I've heard from several veterans that they came back, right, from a deployment, and they described to me symptoms that sound so obviously like PTSD or TBI, and then they were given Adderall. They're like, oh, you're having problems focusing, you're hyper vigilant, here's some Adderall, here's some Xanax. And we know that this stuff, first of all, it can be quite addictive, especially Xanax, but it's a band-aid, and it's a band-aid that can sometimes backfire because it can exacerbate those symptoms. And why am I scratching my head? I'm scratching my head because this isn't the Vietnam era. We've known for decades about PTSD. We've known about TBIs. There's like all these amazing treatments. My brother, by the way, is a neuroscientist, and he was, until recently working with DoD in a lab on traumatic brain injury, blast injuries in particular. Okay, so this is not something new to us. So if this is something that's well known, why are people being given things like Adderall and Xanax, which is clearly not the appropriate drug to give people suffering from these symptoms?
Yeah, and it's sad when you think about it. So to answer your question, one reason is because you're 73,000 clinical mental health professionals short of meeting the demand that is needed within the VA system alone.
Hmm.
Secondly, because of the pharmaceutical influence that lines 84% of the policymakers' pockets that influence their decisions that give us access. Because The clinical model for mental health, the options that we are given to heal, the Western model of medicine, is based on chronic suppression of symptoms. They are
Hmm.
not giving us options to truly heal. And what does that do? It creates a repeat customer for life. This is an incredibly profitable model that has been created, and they were these are clear reasons we don't have access to these modalities. Because what if I could go through one, two, maybe three treatment protocols with community, with the psychedelic assisted therapies, with the proper preparation and integration on the back end, and I can bring true balance to my life, reduce my medications, reduce my symptoms, increase my heart rate variability, rebalance my autonomic nervous system. I would not need to keep going back for refills and surgeries. You look at autoimmune disorders. You look at
Mhm.
uh, forget the name of it. Um, it'll come to me. But you look at chronic pain, autoimmune
Mhm.
disorder, um, degenerative diseases, just hypertension, those
Seems like a
things.
strain. It seems like a strain though on the healthcare system. And I have to ask, like the therapists, right, who are prescribing these medications, they're not necessarily like, oh, well, I want to line my pockets from, you know, having this person dependent. I'm sure that's not what the therapist is thinking, whether that's a private therapist or veteran affairs office, but it just seems really, yeah, I don't know. It just seems really strange to me. Maybe
You
people are overwhelmed in the system. There's not enough therapists, like you said, and so they just give these quick diagnoses without like digging deeper. But
you just
yeah.
you bring up a great point. Is what I've learned through my process, right? And this is my opinion. There is a true difference between doctoring and healing.
Hmm.
Doctors, they're incredible people. The healthcare professionals, they are incredible people, but they are doing what they are taught. And what they are taught is influenced through the medical model, through the pharmaceutical model, that is dictating the options we have to heal. You look at everyone who's come home from this war. Pretty much all of them have been, if they have asked for help or have gone for help, they've received the combat cocktail that you speak of, Adderall, Ambien, right? A stimulant to wake you up in the morning, a tranquilizer to put you to bed, and then they flood you with SSRIs and then pain pills. And that is that's the first step. And let's see how we do from there. It's a shame when I tell you the diagnosis, the diagnoses that I have untangled to get permission for some of these veterans to come through our program, right? To take the multiple personality disorders and the bipolar disorders. No offense to anyone who has these, but the diagnosis is that these men are carrying and men and women are carrying after they are coming home, to realize that no, this is only a response of their trauma. This is why the physiological and the mental symptoms are the way they are. This is why they're carrying such a high allostatic load. Those diagnoses that I've had to rewire in the presence of other doctors on my side, just so they can be approved to come through our program, it would boggle your mind. It would boggle your mind. It's the mind and body is disconnected because of the traumatic experiences. Trauma is not something that happens to us. Trauma is something that remains inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And the empathetic witness is the key to this, right? If a tree falls
Mm.
in a wood and nobody is there, does it make a noise? Right? It's the same thing. If even if I found the words to describe and found the full file folder for the experience that I went through, we are social beings. We thrive on connectivity. Until there is someone significant in my life that I can say these words out loud, be authentic, still be accepted, that's when I start to gain agency over my life. And that's when the post-traumatic growth starts to happen. So the chronic suppression of our symptoms and the way that we are being treated is not even getting close. And it's a clear reason why we're in the crisis that we're in. And,
Right.
and PTSD is one thing. Moral injury is the missing link, right? This is why this crisis is not being addressed, right?
Mm,
It needs communal reconciliation. It needs the validation. It needs the peer support and supported by those with lived experience that say, hey, brother, hey, sister, I see you. I hear you. You said those words out loud. I still love you. We still love you, right? We're going to help you find that love and compassion for yourself again. I this is something I get fired up about because
sure.
when you see and feel what is carried after the service when we come home, and then when you see and feel what is released in these rituals and ceremonies, which sounds non-clinical and woo-woo, but it's a bunch of people who have experienced a very similar experience and have come together for some very specific purposes and intentions, is to release this from our body, release that no longer serves us. And we're going to do it together. That's going to give us that sense of safety and create a container that we can do this together. And that is the healing process. And that is it is completely being missed by the Western model. And so this message in the organizations that we have created to communicate this message is not just for the veteran. Trauma is trauma. The mechanics of trauma are all the same. The mechanics of moral injury are all the same. The conservative lawmaker or the lawmaker in general, very receptive to the veteran voice in this conversation. So those are the voices that are being heard right now. You have a
Hmm.
very small demographic, a very small percentage of the population who is dealing with all of the same symptoms. And so this is a very interesting cohort to study right now. Um,
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that you mentioned trauma is trauma, right? So what the work that you're doing, the advocacy, it's not just beneficial for veterans, but for anybody who, has suffered from trauma. And, when I look at the war experience, right, not just as a blogger, but as somebody who writes books and tries to dig into the psyche of the characters experiencing it, what you see really is a magnification of the real world, right? So if I was going to say, hey, the battlefield is, a subworld, right? This isn't the normal world that most civilians, for example, experience, but it's really a magnification. You see the worst and the best of people. You talk about in the story world, those binary forces that kind of come up against each other and make a story interesting, create tension. I mean, there's so many, right? And some of the most intense binary charges, good versus evil, life versus death, love versus hatred. So those are some of the most intense things, and you find them in the battlefield, right? So it just seems like from what you can take from the world of war, which is an intensification of the human experience, which is so overwhelming. You have to figure out a pathway to come back to it. But as you pointed out, there's a lot that the civilian world can learn from those experiences as well. That's why it's important to share the stories of moral injury that we can all learn from in the civilian world, and to also talk about, trauma and the treatments, that are appropriate. So I could go on a tangent with that, but no, I
here,
think it's great that you're seeing that there are like, and I mean, I think that's a selling point when you're on the Hill. Like, hey, this isn't just beneficial for a small percentage of the population that serves in the military, right? But this is something that all of society could benefit from. And by the way, when you're talking about the moral injury thing, and groups of people coming together to release, I don't think it's woo woo at all, because when I mentioned, when we met at the symposium, I mentioned that I had spoken recently on American Grit about moral injury. So obviously I did my homework before I came, and something that came up over and over again, because I wanted to talk about some of the most effective treatments, is group therapy over individualized therapy, right? And look, it depends on the person. Some people prefer the privacy of individual therapy, but overwhelmingly, what the studies have shown is that people heal more effectively from moral injury in a group therapy setting. So it totally makes sense what you said.
yeah. And I would even say a group setting. And when I hear the word therapy, I think of a directive approach, right? If I'm sitting
Mm,
in group therapy, you have the one that is leading the group that is specifically speaking to someone that is sharing their story. And these ceremonies that we do hold using these tools with very intense
Hmm.
preparation and integration, the group goes through this experience together, right? And until you feel this experience and the energy that can be felt and shared in this experience, um, it differs. So I don't I say that because group therapy and these ceremonies and rituals that are being utilized using these medicines are I think it's the same concept, but the results are kind of night and day, and results that are achieved with them. But yes, moral injury in a group setting, it is the communal reconciliation, right? It's
Yeah.
the authenticity, it's the acceptance, and it's the agency that we gain over our lives, right? That's straight from Dr. Gabor Mate, right? One of the leading
Mm.
doctors in this space, and that's what's missing in our process right now. Um, is there?
Yeah, so that's part of it is also, I mean, speaking about the group effort, right? So kind of pivoting from the therapeutic space, I want to talk about the legislative space as well, or regulatory space, because I think, when we talk about people who don't even want to go near this stuff because of the stigma, right? Maybe in a certain culture, like where you came from, regarding the use of these drugs. So, I think a big step, right, is to get things legalized for there to be regulation, right? And so I know that you have spent quite a bit of time on Capitol Hill unraveling these intricacies. So let's talk about that. So in Congress, in the 2024 Defense Authorization Bill, um, it allowed the Pentagon to study the use of psychedelics within the military population. So the Veterans Affairs Office has permitted research into psychedelic assisted therapy to take place at department facilities, but only when funded by outside organizations. Why now is there this interest from the government in the study of psychedelics? In addition, can you give a snapshot of some of the activities currently taking place on Capitol Hill around potential legislation in the last year?
Yeah, I think the why has become pretty clear. In the last
Hmm.
1 to 2 decades, we have had more U.S. citizens go through mental health treatments than there's just been increasing rates and more than ever that have gone through these treatments, yet the
Hmm.
numbers continue to increase. And right, so it clearly shows when the opposite should have happened. The numbers should be decreasing. So it's showing that the effectiveness of the options we're given to heal are just not effective.
Okay.
You can see
Yeah.
that through stats, right? And I have some stats here. 60% of veterans undergoing cognitive behavioral therapy or prolonged exposure do not experience meaningful improvement. So
Mm.
this is gold standard of mental health right now. 60% and even higher do not experience meaningful improvement. 20 to 30% of individuals treated with SSRIs experience significant symptom reduction, right? 20 to 30%. That's the best that we are achieving. They are just
Mm.
not effective. On the other hand, psilocybin research for depression and anxiety in cancer patients, 80% significant reduction in
Wow.
symptoms in a single session, which is a microdosing session. This is not even a macro dose. Uh,
Hmm.
um, Another study for major depressive disorder, 71% reduction in a single session that lasted 6 to 12 months, still showing significant results.
Hmm.
It's it's clear the inefficacy of the treatments and the results that we're seeing and the promising results that we're seeing with the psychedelic assisted therapies. And so to answer why, the numbers in service over the last 2 decades, a little over 7,000 service members lost. And that
Mm.
same period of time, there have been over 240,000 that have been lost to suicide and pharmaceutical overdoses. Right. 2 years ago, an article released in Military Times saying, oh, in the suicide numbers, we were not counting pharmaceutical overdoses. Those numbers are probably double.
Whoa.
So yeah, it's yeah, I mean it's not laughable, but at the same time, sometimes that's all you can do when you're at the mercy of it. So
So you obviously, when you come to the Hill, you're speaking to legislators, you obviously come armed with your data to show, hey, this is not working. This is why we need to consider an alternative. Um, but what's going on the Hill right now? I know there's been some activity, some push, yeah, to change the status quo regarding psychedelic assisted therapies. Yeah, if you can just give an overview of what's going on right now.
yeah, so I think the two of the main legislative pushes that are happening is the Breakthrough Therapies Act, which is essentially whichever of the psychedelic assisted therapy modalities that the FDA has designated that has breakthrough therapy potential. This act is asking to essentially move it to a Schedule 2 and allow access to research so that we can start moving. Right now, as a Schedule 1 narcotic, it's incredibly expensive to research, and it creates a lot of barriers that is preventing research that is needed. We see the medical efficacy of it. Open the doors to affordable and accessible research, and that's what the Breakthrough Therapies Act is doing. And then you have the Douglas Mike Day psychedelic assisted therapy Save Lives Act, which was released by Crenshaw. This is one of the first holistic alternative medicine bills that have been attached to the National Defense Authorization Act in quite some time. They've been trying to do this with cannabis for the last decade, and so what it takes is you have a handful of gentlemen with lived experience that have gone through these treatment modalities themselves, that have put themselves in position as members of Congress to start making change from within. And that is exactly what you're seeing. You have organizations like the Veterans Mental Health Leadership Coalition being led by a 3-star retired Marine Corps General, Lieutenant General Martin Steele, who is it's an incredible group of advocacy and doctors and professionals and retired military personnel that are saying this works. How can we help you understand that this works? And how can you help us gain access to it? The Crenshaw's bill and the National Defense Authorization Act has actually devoted money to pursuing clinical trials, and hopefully some of these clinical trials are observational studies and proof of concepts for some of these modalities that we know that work. Macro dosing of psilocybin, ayahuasca, the combination of 5-MeO DMT, with these medicines. It, it's hard to communicate it through words. Uh,
Yeah, it's
those who have
complicated.
it is well, and the reason that it is complicated is because you're taking a quantum experience that works from all levels at the same time, and you are trying to communicate it through a linear path through words. And anyone who's ever been through the experience will tell you in the utmost detail, and then they'll follow it up with that did no justice to what actually I experienced. And this is what's
Sure.
in these treatments. So those are the big pushes that are happening. So those who are looking to get involved, those are that's some great legislation to support that can really really save lives. The reason it's being done, look at the numbers, right? The options we're being given are not working. The numbers prove it. It's that simple.
So closing up here, what's your call to action? If somebody cares about this topic, if somebody says, hey, I want to see veterans getting access to these treatments, what can they do to get involved?
First of all, reach out. It doesn't necessarily have to be to me, but to reach out to someone who knows, someone who has lived experience, someone that you know who may have personally struggled or is just looking to increase the results they're getting in their own wellness journey. Um, be an advocate for your own health, right? I found myself in the first 3 to 5 years of being home, and even longer, is being trapped by believing that the Western model was the only option that we had, and the pharmaceuticals were the fix for the problems. There are great, at times they provide great short-term solutions, but it is not something to spend the rest of your life on. So
Yeah.
uh, explore your options, be your own advocate. Is it safe? Is it effective? And is it efficient for you? And the answers that I have found is yes, yes, and yes. And if it is for me, a regular Joe, who just experienced some hardship in life, who has experienced profound healing um, through these modalities, you can do it as well. And make sure it's with someone. If this is an option that you choose, make sure it is through a vetted organization, um, and that you do the preparation and commit to the integration on the back end. These tools will give you the roadmap to what you want your life to look like. It will give you the blueprint. But unless you put the work in when you come home, that blueprint will remain in your closet until that work is done. So the healing process is work, and that's the truth. These are not magic pills. These are not magic bullets. They're just incredibly effective tools that can help us get from A to Z a lot quicker than what's being offered now.